The year was 1768, when the English explorer James Cook set sail from Plymouth aboard the sturdy vessel HMS Endeavour. His mission, at least in official terms, was a noble one: to observe the rare transit of Venus across the face of the Sun, an astronomical event that promised to refine humanity's understanding of the Earth's distance from that fiery star. Yet tucked within his sealed instructions lay a more ambitious and secret directive, one that would forever alter the map of the world. Cook was to seek out and chart the fabled Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, long whispered about by scholars and sailors alike, a vast continent thought to balance the northern masses of Europe, Asia, and America. Whether such a place truly existed remained uncertain, but the prospect had gripped the imagination of Europe for centuries. The Endeavour was no grand ship of war, but a converted coal carrier, chosen for its sturdy build and spacious hold. With a crew of 94 men, including scientists, artists, and sailors hardened by the sea, Cook steered his vessel out into the Atlantic, bound for discoveries that none could yet imagine. Among his passengers was the young botanist Joseph Banks, whose passion for cataloging strange and wondrous plants would soon transform the scientific understanding of the natural world. Alongside him came the artist Sidney Parkinson, whose nimble sketches would preserve the first European glimpses of distant lands and unfamiliar faces. Together, this unlikely fellowship formed a blend of science, art, and seafaring grit, each playing their part in a journey destined to echo through history. Weeks of rough seas and endless horizons tested the patience of the crew, but the promise of adventure kept spirits afloat. Their route carried them southward across the equator, into waters where constellations unfamiliar to European eyes wheeled above. The Southern Cross glittered like a celestial signpost, beckoning them onward into mysteries untold. Cook's leadership proved steady and unyielding. Though stern, he was fair, and his insistence on discipline, cleanliness, and rationed supplies meant the Endeavour sailed healthier than most ships of her era. Scurvy, the bane of seafarers, claimed no great toll, for Cook had learned from earlier voyages the importance of fresh provisions, vinegar, and sauerkraut. In April of 1769, after months at sea, the Endeavour reached the lush island of Tahiti, where Cook and his men established an observatory to record the transit of Venus. The task was carried out with diligence, but the results, though accurate, were less decisive than the Royal Society had hoped. Still, Cook knew his true mission lay ahead. Once the astronomical work was done, he opened his secret orders, revealing instructions to sail further south in search of the great southern continent. Thus began the most daring phase of his voyage. Pushing onward, Cook charted the coast of New Zealand with remarkable precision, revealing it not as a massive landmass attached to a southern continent, but as two large islands separated by a strait. His detailed maps, drawn with patient care, would remain the standard for decades to come. Yet it was not New Zealand alone that destiny held in store. Beyond its coasts, further west, lay the land the Dutch had touched a century earlier, but had left largely unexplored. A vast, mysterious continent Europeans knew only from scattered reports and fragmented charts. The Endeavour battled rough seas as it sailed westward across the Tasman Sea, a stretch of ocean both treacherous and unyielding. At last, in April 1770, the lookout cried out sight of land. Before them stretched the coastline of a place Cook would name New South Wales, a land that shimmered with forests and rolling hills, so unlike the rocky coasts they had known before. Anchoring first at Botany Bay, so called for the astonishing variety of plants gathered by Banks and his companions, the crew set foot upon a continent that had lived in European imagination for centuries, but was now revealed in living color. The first encounters with the land's original inhabitants were cautious and uncertain. Cook and his men, bound by curiosity but also by caution, observed the Aboriginal people from a respectful distance at first. Communication was difficult, and gestures often led to misunderstanding, but there was also a sense of profound awe. Here were people who had thrived for tens of thousands of years in a land Europeans had thought empty and unknown. The land itself brimmed with life, unlike anything Cook or Banks had seen before. Kangaroos bounding across the plains, cockatoos filling the air with raucous cries, and towering eucalypt trees that gave off strange, aromatic scents. For weeks, the Endeavour traced the coastline northward, Cook painstakingly mapping bays, inlets, and headlands. His meticulous notes would later allow England to claim dominion over these new shores, a claim that would bring profound change to the people already living there. Yet for the men aboard the Endeavour, the focus was survival, discovery, and charting the unknown. One night, disaster nearly struck when the ship ran aground upon the jagged coral of the Great Barrier Reef. The hull was torn open, and only frantic effort, lightening the ship and patching the breach, saved them from sinking into the turquoise depths. It was a stark reminder that exploration was as much peril as promise. As the Endeavour limped northward for repairs, Cook's thoughts must have wrestled between duty, ambition, and the enormity of what they had found. They had set out to watch a celestial dance across the sun, but in doing so had revealed to Europe a landmass so vast and strange that it would alter the balance of empires. Australia, though Cook did not yet call it by that name, was no longer a phantom of speculation, but a reality inked onto charts and seared into memory. What began as a scientific voyage had become the dawn of a new chapter in global history, a chapter whose consequences would echo for centuries to come. The Endeavour limped into the mouth of a river estuary in June of 1770, desperate for repairs after the reef collision. Here, Cook and his men found a natural haven where they could beach the vessel and labor tirelessly to make her seaworthy once again. They called the place the Endeavour River, near what would later become the town of Cooktown, and for nearly 7 weeks the crew remained ashore. It was here, perhaps more than anywhere else on the voyage, that the explorers came into closest contact with the Aboriginal people. These encounters were complex, sometimes tinged with tension, sometimes softened by moments of curiosity and exchange. The Europeans marveled at the hunting skills and intimate knowledge of the land displayed by the Gugu-Yimithirr people, while the Aboriginal inhabitants observed the strangers with equal fascination, puzzled by their heavy clothes, strange tools, and enormous floating house anchored in shallows. It was during this period that Joseph Banks and his team gathered a staggering variety of plants, insects, and animals. Many were unknown to science. Kangaroos in particular fascinated Banks, and it was from the Gugu-Yimithirr language that he recorded the word gangaroo, which soon spread through Europe as the name of the bounding marsupial. The artist Parkinson sketched diligently, capturing in careful lines the forms of flora and fauna, unlike anything seen in the Old World. The Aboriginal people, though wary, occasionally traded with the strangers, offering fish and other food in exchange for cloth or small trinkets. Yet mistrust lingered. The British were armed, their intentions unclear, and the Gugu-Yimithirr watched them closely, aware that these newcomers might bring more than curiosity to their shores. Cook himself remained pragmatic, focused on repairing his ship and completing his charts. His journals from this period reveal both admiration for the land's abundance and the detached eye of a surveyor marking bays, rivers, and headlands, as though fixing them into possession by ink and compass. He described the Aboriginal people as far more happier than we Europeans, noting their simplicity of life, their freedom from want, and their apparent lack of greed. Yet, despite such observations, he also believed the land was underutilized by European standards and could thus be claimed for the crown. The gulf between admiration and conquest was wide, but Cook straddled it with the certainty of an officer carrying out his king's command. Once the ship was repaired and refitted, the Endeavour resumed her voyage northward along the coast, sailing through waters strewn with unseen dangers. Cook mapped every headland and inlet with painstaking care, his charts so accurate that modern navigators would later marvel at their precision. He passed Cape Tribulation, so named for the hardships endured there, and Cape York, marking the northernmost tip of the continent. By August, he reached the narrow straits that separated New Holland, as the Dutch had called the land, from New Guinea. These treacherous waters were known as Torres Strait, after the Spanish navigator who had sailed through them in 1606, but never fully charted. Cook braved the passage, proving that the two great landmasses were distinct and separate, and then turned his ship westward into the open waters of the Indian Ocean. It was on Possession Island, just off the northern coast, that Cook performed an act heavy with consequence. Standing upon its rocky shore on the 22nd of August, 1770, he raised the Union Jack and claimed the entire eastern coast of the continent in the name of King George Roman III, dubbing it New South Wales. It was a declaration made without consultation or consent of the land's ancient custodians, who had lived there for countless generations. To Cook and his men, it was the fulfillment of their secret orders, the securing of new territory for the British Empire. To the Aboriginal peoples, though they may not have understood the ritual or its meaning, it marked the beginning of a profound upheaval that would unfold in centuries to come. With his duty complete, Cook turned the Endeavour westward, heading for the island of Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, then a Dutch stronghold in the East Indies. The voyage was grueling, the ship battered and the crew weakened by months at sea. In Batavia, the men found supplies and shipyards to restore the Endeavour, but they also encountered deadly tropical diseases. Fevers swept through the crew, claiming lives that had been spared by scurvy and shipwreck. Even Banks, who had survived storms and reefs, fell dangerously ill, though he recovered. Many others were buried in foreign soil, their journey ending far from home. By 1771, after nearly 3 years at sea, the Endeavour finally returned to England, slipping once more into the familiar waters of the Thames. Cook, Banks, and the surviving crew were hailed as heroes. Their voyage had not only contributed to astronomy and natural science, but had also unveiled lands of immense strategic value to the British Crown. The maps Cook carried were unlike any before, precise and detailed, opening new horizons for empire and commerce. His journals, along with the specimens and drawings collected by Banks and Parkinson, stirred the curiosity of Europe, painting a picture of a vast southern land filled with strange creatures, rich forests, and new peoples. Yet beneath the excitement of discovery lay deeper currents. Cook's claim of possession, made thousands of miles from London in the name of a distant king, would set in motion one of the most significant chapters of colonial history. Within a generation, Britain would establish penal colonies upon those shores, forever altering the lives of the Aboriginal peoples who had thrived there for tens of millennia. What began as a scientific voyage, noble in its intent, would ripple outward into consequences both celebrated and tragic, shaping the destiny of a continent and its people. As for Cook himself, the voyage cemented his reputation as one of the greatest navigators of his age. But his story did not end with the return of the Endeavour. He would sail again, embarking on further journeys that pushed the boundaries of the known world, journeys that would carry him into fame, controversy, and ultimately into a fate as dramatic as any explorer of the age could imagine. The discovery of Australia, however, would remain his most enduring legacy, an act of exploration that bridged science and empire, wonder and conquest, forever inscribing his name upon the history of a vast and ancient land. When James Cook returned to England in 1771, the air buzzed with curiosity and admiration. His charts of New Zealand and the eastern coast of New South Wales astonished navigators and geographers. They were works of precision in an age when many maps were still adorned with guesswork and mythical sea monsters. Cook had transformed speculation into knowledge, and knowledge in that century was power. The Admiralty wasted little time in planning new ventures, for the race to claim lands and secure trade routes was intensifying among Europe's rival empires. Britain now had a foothold in the South Pacific, and the Admiralty saw Cook as the man to expand it further. Meanwhile, Joseph Banks became something of a celebrity in his own right. The vast collection of plants, seeds, shells, and animal specimens he brought back, captured the imagination of scientists and aristocrats alike. His garden at his London home soon blossomed with exotic species from the South Pacific, and his influence at the Royal Society and with King George Roman III made him a powerful figure in scientific circles. It was Banks who would later press for the colonization of Australia, arguing that the fertile lands and harbors Cook had described were ideal for a British settlement. Though the voyage had ended, its ripples spread through politics, science, and society, shaping future decisions that would change the world. For Cook, however, there was little time for rest. In 1772, he was once again at sea, this time commanding two ships, the Resolution and the Adventure, on a mission to probe the mystery of Terra Australis even further. Despite having charted New Zealand and Eastern Australia, many still believed in the existence of a great southern continent stretching across the polar regions. Cook sailed deep into the Antarctic Circle, braving icebergs and freezing gales, farther south than any man before him. He proved that no habitable continent existed in those latitudes, shattering a geographical myth that had endured for centuries. Though he never saw the Antarctic mainland, he came close enough to glimpse fields of ice stretching to the horizon, an unbroken wilderness of white. The second voyage took Cook again through the Pacific, where he visited islands from Tonga to Easter Island and Tahiti once more. His encounters with the islanders varied, sometimes marked by hospitality and exchange, other times by conflict and bloodshed. Yet through it all, Cook's reputation as a navigator and leader only grew. His charts continued to reshape European understanding of the Pacific, transforming scattered, half-known islands into navigable worlds on paper. By the time he returned in 1775, he had secured his place as one of the greatest explorers of his century, rivaled only by the likes of Magellan or Columbus. But it was his third and final voyage that would define the dramatic close of his life. In 1776, Cook embarked again, this time seeking the elusive Northwest Passage, a sea route across the top of North America that promised to link Europe and Asia more directly. The mission took him across the Pacific once more, revisiting familiar islands and discovering new ones along the way. In January 1778, Cook and his crew became the first Europeans to set foot in the Hawaiian Islands, which he named the Sandwich Islands in honor of the Earl of Sandwich, then First Lord of the Admiralty. At first, the Hawaiians welcomed him with generosity, exchanging food and supplies with the strangers who had arrived in their massive floating homes. Cook's presence coincided with a local festival that honored a god associated with arrival and renewal, and some have speculated that the islanders initially believed the British to be divine messengers. From Hawaii, Cook sailed northward to the coast of what is now Alaska, probing icy seas in search of the Northwest Passage. He charted much of the Alaskan coastline and reached as far as the Bering Strait, but impassable ice fields thwarted his ambitions. Forced to turn back, he returned southward, weary from the fruitless search. Once again, he anchored in Hawaii in January of 1779, seeking rest and provisions before the long voyage home. But this time, the reception was not so warm. The initial sense of awe had faded, and tensions grew between the Hawaiians and the British, whose demands for food and resources strained relations. A theft of one of Cook's small boats led to a confrontation on the shore. In the skirmish that followed, Cook was struck down, killed in the surf by islanders defending their own. It was a sudden and violent end for a man who had charted vast oceans and crossed the limits of the known world. News of his death reverberated across Europe. To some, Cook was a hero, a man who had expanded the frontiers of knowledge with unparalleled courage. To others, he was a symbol of imperial ambition, whose discoveries paved the way for conquest and colonization. His voyages had enriched science, geography, and navigation, but they had also opened the door to upheaval for the peoples and lands he had encountered. In Australia, the Aboriginal peoples would soon feel the weight of British settlement. a process made possible by Cook's meticulous charts and his declaration of possession in 1770. The story of Cook's discovery of Australia did not end with his death, however. His voyages had set the stage for Britain's expansion into the Pacific, and within a few short years, his charts of New South Wales would guide the first fleet to Botany Bay. What Cook had described as fertile, unclaimed land would become the site of Britain's first penal colony, altering the course of Australian history forever. For the Aboriginal peoples, it marked the beginning of dispossession, disease, and disruption of a way of life that had endured for tens of thousands of years. For Britain, it was the opening of a new frontier, a solution to overcrowded prisons at home and a foothold in the rich Pacific trade. Cook had gone to sea in search of a scientific observation, guided by the transit of Venus across the sun. Yet his true legacy lay not in the stars, but in the lands he revealed to European eyes, lands that would carry his name and his influence long after his body lay buried in a faraway island. The story of his discovery of Australia was only one chapter in a larger saga of exploration, but it was the chapter that would echo most profoundly through history, reshaping a continent and binding it to the fate of an empire thousands of miles away. When Cook's charts and journals of New South Wales reached Britain, they stirred an interest that quickly moved beyond curiosity and science. For the Admiralty and government officials, the eastern coast of Australia was not simply a marvel of nature or a puzzle of geography. It was an opportunity. The American colonies were on the brink of revolution, and Britain faced the possibility of losing its principal site for transporting convicts. With prisons at home overflowing and social pressures mounting, officials began to look toward Cook's newly charted land as a potential solution. Joseph Banks, whose influence in court had only grown, became one of the strongest advocates for settlement. He spoke of fertile soils, safe harbors, and resources that could sustain a colony. Though his enthusiasm glossed over the hardships such an endeavor would entail, it convinced decision-makers who were eager for a fresh outlet for Britain's expanding empire. In the years that followed Cook's death, the image of Australia began to shift in the European imagination. No longer just a distant and mysterious coast, it was presented as a land of promise, ready for cultivation and control. Pamphlets circulated with descriptions of its forests, rivers, and wildlife, often based on Banks' accounts. Yet little thought was given to the people who already lived there. To British eyes, the Aboriginal nations were invisible in the legal sense. The doctrine of terra nullius, or land belonging to no one, was applied, ignoring the fact that Aboriginal peoples had cultivated, managed, and thrived in the landscape for tens of thousands of years. This legal fiction would justify Britain's claim to sovereignty, and in doing so, plant the seeds of conflict that would echo for centuries. Meanwhile, the myth of Cook himself grew. His careful notes, his seemingly humane observations about the Aboriginal way of life, and his reputation for fairness at sea all contributed to a heroic image. In England, Cook was celebrated as a man of reason and science, a navigator who expanded the frontiers of human knowledge. Statues, portraits, and books enshrined him in public memory. Yet the duality of his legacy, between enlightenment and empire, was rarely confronted in his own time. To those in power, he was the man who had secured Britain a new realm across the seas, a realm that might replace America as the next great imperial venture. By 1786, the decision had been made. Britain would establish a penal colony on the shores Cook had once described with scientific detachment. The first fleet, carrying over 700 convicts along with Marines, officers, and supplies, set sail in 1787 under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip. Their destination was Botany Bay, the very place Cook had named for its abundance of strange plants. Yet when Phillip arrived in January 1788, he found the bay unsuitable, its soil poor, its water scarce, and its anchorage exposed. Instead, he sailed a little north, into a sheltered cove that Cook had noted in passing but not explored in detail. Phillip called it Sydney Cove, and there, beneath the summer sun, the British flag was raised once more. Cook's charts had guided them, and his claim of possession had paved the way. The discovery had become settlement, and settlement soon hardened into colonization. For the Aboriginal peoples of the Eora Nation, whose country encompassed the coves and rivers around Sydney, the arrival of the fleet was an event of profound disruption. At first, there were gestures of curiosity and tentative contact, much as Cook had experienced 18 years earlier. But the sheer scale of the newcomers, their need for land, and their unfamiliar ways of life created tensions that would soon flare into violence. Diseases brought from Europe spread quickly, devastating communities who had no immunity to such illnesses. Land that had sustained generations was cleared for farms and settlements. The way of life that had seemed eternal began to unravel under the weight of colonization. Still, Cook's story remained central to the narrative told in Britain. His discovery was recounted as the heroic opening of a new world, with little mention of the consequences for those who already lived there. Maps across Europe now bore the outline of New South Wales, a territory of the Crown, its coasts inked with the precision of Cook's surveys. He had charted not just bays and rivers, but the very trajectory of empire, his actions binding Australia to Britain's fate. Back in England, Joseph Banks watched from afar as his vision of settlement took shape. The plants and animals he had once collected as scientific curiosities now became symbols of a distant colony. Kangaroos and black swans, emblems of a land beyond imagination, were paraded in the gardens and museums of London. Yet for all the fascination, few in Britain could grasp the full reality of life in the colony, its struggles, its violence, and the enduring resistance of its first peoples. Cook himself never lived to see this transformation, but his name was invoked at every turn. His journals became the foundation of Australia's European history, his maps the framework for colonization, and his memory the rallying point for imperial pride. Statues would one day rise in Sydney, Melbourne, and Honolulu, each proclaiming his role as discoverer and navigator. But beneath those statues lay the deeper, more complex truth that Cook's discovery was not an empty land unveiled to the world, but the beginning of a collision between two vastly different civilizations. As the 18th century drew to a close, Cook's legacy had already become larger than life. He was not just an explorer now, but a symbol of Britain's age of expansion, a figure through whom the empire saw its own reflection, curious, ambitious, and relentless. Yet the story was far from complete. The settlement at Sydney Cove was only the first step in a vast and tumultuous history, one that would stretch across the continent Cook had first charted, shaping its destiny and that of its people for centuries to come. The early years of settlement in New South Wales bore little resemblance to the grand visions painted by Joseph Banks or the orderly claims made by James Cook on a distant island. When the first fleet anchored in Sydney Cove in January 1788, the reality that met Captain Arthur Phillip and his company was harsh and unyielding. The soil proved stubborn, the unfamiliar climate confused even experienced farmers, and the stores of food dwindled faster than anticipated. Convicts, many of them city dwellers unaccustomed to hard labor, struggled to clear land and grow crops in a land unlike any they had known. Hunger loomed as a constant threat, and the colony teetered more than once on the brink of collapse. The relationship with the Eora people, whose land encompassed Sydney Cove, quickly shifted from tentative encounters to tense standoffs. Phillip, unlike some of his officers, believed strongly that peaceful coexistence was possible and sought to establish communication. In 1789, he ordered the capture of a man named Arabanu, hoping to learn language and customs through him. Though treated with relative kindness, Arabanu soon succumbed to smallpox, a disease brought by the newcomers that tore through the Eora with devastating effect. Whole communities were decimated within months, and the grief and anger that followed deepened mistrust. Cook's journals had marveled at the health and simplicity of the Aboriginal peoples he encountered, but within a single year of permanent settlement, the impact of European arrival was catastrophic. Despite these grim beginnings, the settlement slowly took root. New arrivals brought fresh supplies, and the colony expanded beyond its precarious beachhead. Explorers ventured inland, charting rivers and mountain ranges, often retracing or building upon the outlines Cook had once inked along the coast. Each step further into the interior brought new clashes with Aboriginal nations, who resisted encroachment on their lands. The narrative of discovery, which had begun with Cook's sighting of Botany Bay, was now becoming one of conquest. The vast continent he had claimed for the crown was proving anything but empty. It was a living tapestry of peoples, languages, and cultures, each bound deeply to their land. Cook's name, however, continued to serve as a powerful touchstone for the British settlers. He was remembered in speeches, toasted at official gatherings, and honored as the man who had first unveiled Australia to Europe. Streets, towns, and bays bore his name, a constant reminder of the voyage that had begun it all. Yet, among the Aboriginal peoples, the memory of his landing carried a different meaning. Oral histories preserved the moment when strangers in great ships appeared on the horizon, carrying with them both wonder and disaster. For them, Cook became a symbol not of discovery but of intrusion, the first step in a chain of events that brought dispossession and sorrow. Back in Britain, Cook's story was celebrated with little nuance. He was elevated to the pantheon of great explorers, his voyages depicted in paintings and books that emphasized triumph and curiosity. His encounters with the Aboriginal people were often romanticized, portrayed as moments of noble exchange rather than the fraught and unequal interactions they were. Few paused to consider the deeper implications of his act of possession, or the lives that had been upended by the flag he raised on Possession Island. Cook, in the British imagination, remained a hero of empire, a man whose courage had pushed back the veil of the unknown. Yet within the colony itself, Cook's discovery took on a more practical significance. His charts remained invaluable, guiding ships through treacherous coastal waters and providing a framework for further exploration. His notes on the flora, fauna, and resources of New South Wales informed early agricultural efforts, even as settlers struggled to adapt European methods to a foreign land. In many ways, Cook's meticulous observations had made survival possible, even if they could not shield the settlers from hardship or conflict. His presence lingered not just in memory but in the very tools by which the colony grew. As decades passed, Cook's voyage began to be remembered less as a scientific mission and more as the founding moment of a nation. Schoolchildren in the growing colony were taught to revere him as the discoverer of Australia, glossing over the reality that the continent had been inhabited for tens of thousands of years before his arrival. This narrative, born of empire, became woven into the identity of the settlers, offering them a story of origin that connected their fragile new society to the grandeur of Britain and its age of exploration. Cook's discovery, stripped of its complexity, became myth, but even as the myth solidified, tensions persisted. Aboriginal resistance continued across the expanding frontier, challenging the notion that the land had been peacefully claimed. Stories of conflict, disease, and survival ran parallel to the official tale of discovery and settlement. Cook's name echoed through both narratives, though in vastly different tones: honor and reverence for some, sorrow and loss for others. In this way, his discovery remained a point of division as much as unity, a reminder of the layered and contested nature of history. By the early 19th century, the colony of New South Wales had grown from a desperate outpost into a bustling settlement, its population swelling with convicts, soldiers, and free settlers. The coastlines Cook had charted were now dotted with farms, towns, and shipping routes. His legacy, once confined to journals and maps, had become embodied in the very landscape of colonization. Yet the questions his discovery raised about possession, justice, and the clash of cultures remained unresolved, echoing beneath the official triumph. Cook had never intended to establish a colony. His orders had been to observe, to chart, to report. But the power of discovery lies not only in the act itself but in the consequences it unleashes. His landing at Botany Bay, his raising of the Union Jack, and his detailed maps were all small acts at the time, but together they set in motion forces far larger than he could have foreseen. In that sense, his discovery of Australia was not merely a moment in history. It was the spark that lit a chain of events still unfolding across the centuries. As the colony in New South Wales pushed outward, the memory of James Cook's voyage remained firmly entrenched in both official records and popular imagination. His journals were published and republished, each edition fueling the notion that Britain's claim to Australia was both natural and inevitable. Paintings depicted his landing at Botany Bay as a serene moment of discovery, with Cook extending a hand of peace and the Aboriginal people observing in quiet curiosity. These images glossed over the reality of confusion, resistance, and the yawning gulf of misunderstanding between cultures. Yet such portrayals became powerful tools of empire, reinforcing the idea that Cook's discovery was the beginning of history for a land long inhabited by its first peoples. Within the colony, Cook's presence was everywhere. Streets, schools, and public institutions bore his name, and his portrait adorned walls as a reminder of the man who had made settlement possible. Every generation of settlers was taught to see Cook not merely as an explorer, but as a founding father. His voyage became the cornerstone of a national narrative, one that emphasized discovery, courage, and British destiny. But this selective memory excluded as much as it included. Aboriginal voices, which told of Cook's arrival as a rupture, were silenced in official histories. Oral traditions carried forward stories of a tall, commanding figure who had come from the sea, bringing disruption and change. For many indigenous communities, Captain Cook became a symbolic figure representing not just the man himself, but the entire weight of colonization. Meanwhile, back in Britain, Cook's reputation continued to grow into legend. His story was folded into the broader tale of the Enlightenment, celebrated as a triumph of reason and exploration. He was placed alongside Galileo, Newton, and Darwin in the pantheon of men who had reshaped humanity's understanding of the world. His voyages were praised not only for their geographic achievements, but also for their scientific contributions. New species catalogued, new charts drawn, new peoples encountered. Yet few in Britain reckoned with the darker shadows of his legacy, or the consequences his discovery had set in motion for those who had lived in Australia for millennia. By the mid-19th century, the colony had expanded far beyond Sydney Cove. New towns dotted the coastline, inland expeditions crossed the Blue Mountains, and vast tracts of land were claimed for farming and grazing. Each new settlement traced its lineage back to Cook's discovery, as though his act of possession had granted permission for every subsequent expansion. To many colonists, Cook embodied the spirit of progress, the man who had first looked upon the shores they now called home. Annual commemorations and monuments ensured that his memory remained alive, binding the growing society to its imperial origins. Yet beneath the celebratory veneer, the consequences of Cook's discovery deepened. Aboriginal peoples across the continent resisted encroachment, sometimes through open conflict, other times through quiet persistence and adaptation. Stories spread of frontier battles, of massacres and reprisals, of lives lost on both sides. To the settlers, these conflicts were obstacles on the road to progress. To the Aboriginal peoples, they were struggles for survival. In many communities, Cook's name became synonymous with the arrival of all that followed: the ships, the soldiers, the diseases, the fences cutting across ancestral land. For them, Cook was not just a man of the past, but a living presence in their historical memory, an emblem of disruption and loss. As Australia moved toward self-governance in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Cook's role in the national story only expanded. Federation in 1901 united the colonies into a single commonwealth, and Cook was invoked as a unifying figure. Politicians and educators leaned heavily on the myth of his discovery, presenting it as the true beginning of the Australian nation. Schoolbooks spoke of 1770 as the moment Australia entered history, overlooking the tens of thousands of years of culture and continuity that preceded it. In this way, Cook's discovery became a cornerstone of national identity, celebrated in parades, anniversaries, and public speeches. But history is never static, and by the 20th century, cracks began to appear in the heroic narrative. Scholars, activists, and Aboriginal leaders began to challenge the myth, pointing out the silences and distortions embedded in the story. They reminded the world that Cook had not discovered Australia. Its peoples had been there since time immemorial. They questioned the doctrine of terra nullius that had justified British claims, exposing it as a convenient fiction. And they insisted that Cook's arrival marked not the birth of a nation, but the beginning of dispossession, a wound still felt across generations. The duality of Cook's legacy, hero to some, harbinger of loss to others, became more pronounced with each passing decade. Statues raised in his honor became flashpoints of debate, their plaques proclaiming him the discoverer of Australia, while Aboriginal voices pushed back, demanding recognition of their own history. In literature, art, and public discourse, Cook's figure was reimagined and contested, no longer a one-dimensional hero but a symbol through which Australians grappled with their past. Yet despite these tensions, the story of Cook's discovery retained its power. It remained embedded in national ceremonies, woven into the collective imagination, even as it was questioned and reinterpreted. For many Australians of European descent, Cook symbolized courage, curiosity, and endurance. For many Aboriginal Australians, he symbolized disruption, loss, and survival against overwhelming odds. His legacy was not a single story but a dialogue between competing truths, a reminder that discovery is never simple and that history is written from many perspectives. By the time Australia stood on the threshold of the modern era, Cook's discovery had become more than a historical event. It had become a mirror. In it, Australians saw their hopes, their contradictions, and their unresolved struggles with identity. His voyage was the spark, but the fire it lit had burned in ways he could never have foreseen, reshaping not only a continent but the meaning of history itself. As the 20th century unfolded, James Cook's name continued to carry immense weight, but the way his story was told began to change. For generations, Australians had grown up with a single, polished narrative: Cook as the great discoverer, the brave navigator who brought civilization to a distant land. His image appeared in textbooks, on coins, and even in the names of suburbs, towns, and streets. In 1970, the bicentenary of his landing at Botany Bay was celebrated with parades, monuments, and grand speeches. A replica of the Endeavour sailed along the Australian coast, retracing Cook's route to popular acclaim. To many, it was a proud moment of national identity, honoring the man whose voyage had supposedly given birth to modern Australia. Yet beneath the fanfare, dissenting voices grew louder. Aboriginal leaders and communities pointed out that the celebration was not a birthday but a reminder of dispossession. For them, 1770 was not the dawn of discovery but the beginning of invasion. Protests accompanied the bicentenary events, with banners declaring, "Captain Cook didn't discover Australia. He invaded it." These words cut through the polished ceremonies, demanding that the nation reckon with a truth long ignored: that Australia had never been empty, and that its first peoples had lived, thrived, and cared for the land for over 60,000 years before Cook's arrival. This clash of perspectives marked a turning point. Historians began to dig deeper into Cook's journals, revealing the complexity of his observations, his genuine respect for Aboriginal life, his recognition of their health and independence, but also his role in laying the foundation for British claims of sovereignty. Scholars re-examined the doctrine of terra nullius, eventually leading to legal challenges that culminated in the 1992 Mabo decision, where Australia's High Court finally acknowledged the existence of native title. The seeds of that acknowledgement could be traced back to 1770, to Cook's declaration on Possession Island that ignored the presence of thriving nations across the continent. For Aboriginal Australians, Cook's story became both deeply personal and widely symbolic. Oral traditions remembered him as the figure who opened the door to waves of settlers, soldiers, and laws that stripped them of their land and rights. In some communities, Captain Cook became a shorthand for colonization itself, a larger-than-life character whose name was invoked in stories about change, disruption, and survival. These stories were not mere folklore but living history, passed down to help explain the struggles and injustices of the present. In the broader public sphere, debates over Cook's legacy spilled into art, literature, and politics. Poets and playwrights reimagined his voyages through Aboriginal eyes, questioning the very language of discovery. Painters depicted not the serene images of European art, but the tension, confusion, and resistance that had marked those first encounters. Activists demanded that statues and plaques be corrected to reflect the truth, that Cook had not discovered an empty land but had claimed a continent already rich with culture and history. Each debate reflected the growing awareness that Cook's story was not only about the past, but also about the ongoing struggle to reconcile two visions of Australia, one built on empire and one rooted in the enduring sovereignty of its first peoples. At the same time, Cook's reputation as a navigator and scientist remained intact on the global stage. Mariners still admired his charts, which had guided countless ships safely through treacherous waters. Astronomers and historians of science still celebrated his meticulous work observing the transit of Venus. In classrooms abroad, he was remembered as one of the greatest explorers of the Enlightenment, his name listed alongside Magellan, Columbus, and Drake. Yet, in Australia, his legacy was far more complicated, burdened by the weight of what followed his landfall. By the early 21st century, the contest over Cook's memory had become part of Australia's national identity crisis. In cities, statues of Cook were sometimes defaced with paint or graffiti, scrawled with messages like "No pride in genocide." In Parliament, debates raged over whether Australia Day, celebrated on January 26, the date of the First Fleet's arrival in 1788, should be moved or renamed, given its painful associations for Aboriginal Australians. Cook's name surfaced again and again in these debates, a reminder of the enduring power of his story. Was he a hero to be celebrated, a villain to be condemned, or a symbol too complex to fit neatly into either role? For many Australians, the answer lay not in erasing Cook, but in telling the full story, acknowledging both his brilliance as a navigator and the devastating consequences of his voyages. Museums and cultural institutions began to shift their exhibits, incorporating Aboriginal perspectives alongside the traditional narratives. School curriculums slowly changed, teaching children that Australia's history did not begin in 1770, but stretched back tens of thousands of years. Cook's discovery was no longer presented as the simple act of unveiling an empty land, but as a moment of encounter, one that carried both wonder and tragedy. The figure of Captain James Cook, once a flawless hero, had become a contested symbol. For some, he remained the face of courage and exploration, the man who expanded the horizons of human knowledge. For others, he embodied the loss of land, culture, and freedom. His story had evolved into a mirror, reflecting the nation's ongoing struggle with its past and its identity. In that mirror, Australians saw both the light of discovery and the shadow of dispossession, intertwined in a way that could never again be untangled. And so, the story of Cook's discovery of Australia was no longer just about a voyage across the seas in 1770. It had become a story about memory, power, and perspective, a story that reached into the heart of modern Australia and demanded that the nation look honestly at where it had come from and where it might yet go. In the end, the story of Captain James Cook's discovery of Australia is not a tale that can be neatly tied with a ribbon, nor can it be confined to a single point of view. It begins with a voyage of science and exploration, a daring journey across vast oceans by a man driven by curiosity and discipline. It moves through the moment of landfall at Botany Bay, when Cook and his crew stepped onto a shore that was already home to the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. From there it stretches forward into centuries of colonization, settlement, resistance, and survival, each chapter reshaping the meaning of that first encounter. Cook himself did not live to see the long consequences of his actions. He died violently in Hawaii in 1779, struck down in a clash with islanders during his third Pacific voyage. To his contemporaries, his death only cemented his legend as a martyr to the cause of exploration. Yet for Australia, his legacy continued to grow far beyond his own lifetime, evolving into something larger than the man himself. For generations, he was remembered as the great discoverer, the founding figure whose vision made a nation possible. This was the myth that colonists carried with them as they spread across the land, the myth that justified their presence and their dominion. It was taught in schools, celebrated in statues, and enshrined in national rituals. But as the nation matured, the myth came under scrutiny. The voices of Aboriginal Australians grew stronger, reminding everyone that discovery is not discovery when the land is already inhabited, that possession is not possession when it rests on denial. Their histories, carried through song, story, and memory, gave depth and challenge to the story of Cook, transforming it from a tale of triumph into a dialogue about truth. Today, Cook's legacy is both celebrated and contested. He remains a figure of extraordinary achievement. The sailor who mapped uncharted waters, the commander who held his crew together through unimaginable hardship, the observer who expanded Europe's knowledge of the natural world. But alongside that admiration lies the acknowledgement that his voyage marked the beginning of a profound rupture for Australia's First Peoples, a rupture that continues to shape lives and politics to this day. In this tension lies the true complexity of history, not a single narrative, but many voices speaking at once, sometimes in harmony, often in conflict. Australia itself has grown into a nation that grapples openly with this dual inheritance. Museums now present Cook's voyages alongside Aboriginal accounts of first contact. Schoolchildren learn about his courage at sea, but also about the cultures that predated him by tens of thousands of years. National debates over statues, anniversaries, and commemorations are not signs of division alone, but of a society willing to confront its past and question the myths it once took for granted. Each new perspective does not erase the old but layers upon it, building a richer, if more complicated, tapestry. Cook's discovery, then, is not a single moment fixed in 1770. It is a living story, one that continues to evolve with each generation that tells it. To some, it is a story of ambition, science, and endurance. To others, it is a story of loss, invasion, and resilience. To many, it is both inseparable and intertwined. His figure still looms large, not only on the pages of history books, but in the debates of parliaments, the canvases of artists, and the memories of families whose ancestors stood on the shores as the Endeavour sailed into sight. As Australia looks forward, Cook's legacy remains a challenge and an opportunity. It challenges the nation to face uncomfortable truths about its beginnings, to listen to voices too long silenced, to recognize that history does not belong to one people alone. And it offers the opportunity to weave those truths into a more inclusive story, one that honors both the navigators who crossed oceans and the custodians who cared for the land for countless generations. In that weaving lies the chance to move beyond myths of discovery toward a deeper understanding of encounter, consequence, and continuity. Captain James Cook set out on a voyage to observe the heavens and map the earth, but he ended up changing the fate of a continent. His journey across the Pacific was one of courage and precision, but its legacy was one of upheaval and transformation. The story of his discovery of Australia is not just about where he went, but about what followed and how those ripples still reach us today. It is a story of oceans crossed and worlds collided, of triumph and tragedy interwoven, of a past that continues to shape the present. And in that story, told and retold through centuries, Cook remains what he has always been, a symbol, a man whose voyage marked the beginning of a chapter in human history that is still being written.